welcome to the Hindu Women's Festival 2021, hosted by Tattva, an independent authorship platform. This festival provides an opportunity to explore all things relating to the experience of being a woman through a Hindu lens. My name is Drishti, and I'm delighted to be joined by Janhavi Dadarkar today. Janhavi ji is the founder and board member of the Academy for Board Excellence. She holds several board positions and is the lead for governance at the IOD. Namaste and welcome, Janhavi ji.
Namaste, Drishti.
So Janhavi ji, it feels particularly apt to have this conversation with you about leadership and Dharma, because you train directors and leaders across the country, and if I'm not mistaken, internationally too. Could you tell us a little bit more about your day-to-day and that experience?
Absolutely, and thank you as ever for inviting, and it's great to be having this conversation with you, Drishti, because it's always interesting when I'm at work that we look at very academic and business models of what leadership is, and although we try to cover the whole plethora and we try and sort of look at different jurisdictions, ultimately what I would say is what I do at work when we are talking about leadership, and when I look at the models of leadership, we ultimately end up with three key definitions of leadership, and or three elements that say what a leader is, and that is someone that has a following, two, someone that can motivate or inspire people, therefore builds that following, and three, inspires or motivates them for a common goal or objective. So in my workplace, I suppose I've never thought of it like that, but absolutely, a lot of what I do, I'm talking to boards, I'm talking to people that are leaders of their organizations and that need to set the tone from the top. And when we talk about it in these three paradigms, I suppose, one of the things I've always sort of felt is we're missing something there, because when you talk about it in those three elements, success is therefore defined by, do you have a following? Mm-hmm. Did you help them achieve that common goal? And did you inspire people to do those things?
Right.
And so in a way, an element of doing the right thing isn't necessarily in that definition of leadership, if we really think about it.
It's amoral in that sense.
Well, it's, yeah, you can be a leader. I mean, and we know from history, there were many leaders that were not just amoral, but immoral. Mm. So there isn't that definition. Leadership doesn't inherently have in it that concept of goodness, which for me is always really interesting, because if we compare it to Indian words for leadership, and I was trying to find, well, what word do we use for leadership? And there are many, by the way, there are so many that we could use. But the most common one, I suppose, that is used in India is neta or netri. And if we look at the etymology of the word neta or netri, it comes from ni, which is nyaya, which means justice. So it's actually saying that a leader is someone that is an upholder of justice.
How fascinating.
So for me, that is absolutely key for leadership, that somehow we need to integrate an element of what we believe success looks like. And certainly for me, from a cultural perspective, that's what our language has done for us in many ways. It's looked at this word in a much more holistic way. Now, there are other words like agraga, buroga, there are various words that could be used, but they're not used in common parlance. They're actually used very specifically when you mean someone at the front, which is what leader in the English dictionary is defined as. So for me, yes, I do teach it in my workplace, but one of the things I hope I bring to that facilitation and the training is also this wider perspective, some of the philosophy that we have, because for me, ultimately, what I'm trying to do is elevate leadership to another level, Because if we can create better directors, if we can create better leaders, even in the corporate world, then we're achieving something. So that's certainly my personal goal anyway, both at work and I suppose in all the other activities I try and do.
Absolutely. And, you know, as you were saying that, Janhavi, the thought that came to my mind was about how language informs our very experience of the world. So I'm sure it's in philosophy of language, but like when we have a word to categorize something, we can connect with it, but also we can recognize it. So the biggest or the most, like the first thing that comes to mind is the example of snow. So we have one word for snow. We might have like 3 ways of describing ice, maybe in English. That is what is common effectively. Maybe we'll add in like an adjective before it, so like fluffy snow, or, you know, not so fluffy snow, so on and so forth. But I think it's in different cultures, and it might be in the Eskimo culture, whereby there are over 80 words for snow. Now, if we take a moment just to like imagine what that experience is like, when you have that many words, you don't just see snow.
Yes.
You see different nuances, you see different changes, you see the subtlety of it. But if we lack the language, our consciousness can't go there. So as you're describing neta and netri and how it's linked to justice, to good, to upholding that which is right, and then leadership in the way, in the common parlance that you and I know it here in Britain, if there is an absence of that, it surely affects our behavior, our psychology, and how we approach these responsibilities also.
And that's so true, Drishti. And that's not to say that we somehow hold a monopoly on good leaders. We know many people that have been bad netas or bad netris. But to me, it's, if you really want to do it, you need to have that deeper understanding of the words, because you're absolutely right. As we start understanding those words, as we start understanding that culture, that's how we elevate ourselves. And for me, perhaps that is what's missing in some of our academic models that we do when we talk about leadership. Because I think I was saying to you before, one of the, or a few of the models that we look at when we look at leadership, historically, it used to be what we call command and control. And leadership historically came about from military, because you needed people at the top to be listened to, and you needed people to follow. And so there was very much, and the corporate world followed, actually many people from the military ended up in the corporate world as well. And this style of leadership that people must follow us just came on to that. But the language probably didn't help either, because when we look at how in India the war was fought, or at least many parts of it, Gandhi's way was not to have followership because he commanded it. It was, well, if you believe what I do is right, come along with me. So it's a really interesting one. And even in the West now, there's a big discussion about what we call servant leadership.
Yeah.
But if we talk about servant leadership, again, I think there's that element missing of what does it fundamentally mean in a holistic way that leadership needs. And so for me, I've been sort of trying to coin this word dharmic leadership to try and help me understand what I want out of leadership. And it comes exactly like you said, it comes with those sort of cultural nuances, and culture's not something you build overnight. Culture comes with a long time of watching, experiential learning, as well as linguistic learning as well. So I think language has a big part to play in how we view what a particular word means.
Yeah,
and how we behave.
Yeah, if I just extend on that, like as you were speaking, and we're revisiting this notion of servant leadership. We're obviously introducing a hierarchy. We're saying there is someone higher, there is someone lower. You know, if I think about even just like how Sanskrit words are translated, you know, Bhagwan is translated commonly into English as God, we know this isn't true. It actually means enlightened being, and there are 8 different qualities of Bhaga that define what an enlightened being is. You've got Shri, that is often translated to Lord. Again, you start thinking of a hierarchy, but really Shri means someone who beautifies the environment and makes everyone feel uplifted. And so these nuances, I think, sometimes are lost in translation, and we forget some of that beauty. But as you were speaking, what was becoming really clear is that there is an architecture that we are operating in. There is an architecture of what success looks like, and if I think of us navigating that world as women, it is undoubtedly different, right? Because success is defined by measures or KPIs or metrics that come, perhaps I would venture to say, more naturally to men, or the expression of the masculine, rather than the expression of the feminine. And I wonder if you see this play out, one as, someone who has held many positions as a Hindu female leader, and then also in your day-to-day, when you're advising directors and leaders nationally and internationally.
Yeah, it's great, and everything you say just makes me want to, dive even more deeply into sort of language and everything that you sort of talked about. So those words that you said, and how they have different layers. So really interestingly, one of the most recent organisations that I've formed is with colleagues who are leaders in their own right and have been very used. Many of them are sort of retired from having been really high up in their professional careers, and they are now sort of doing more on the sort of teaching and facilitation or the academic study side. And so basically I'm working with 20 different leaders here, and it's really interesting that we teach every day this notion of we must work collectively, and many of them teach this idea of leadership in a servant leadership model. But one of the first questions many of them were sort of asking me is, oh, what title are you going to have, Janhavi, then? Are you going to be the CEO then? And what are we then? We want to be the Neds, or we want and it was a really fascinating discussion, because for me it was I've never sort of perceived or wanted titles and accolades. For me, you get that following, if what you are doing is the right thing, and you build that leadership. For me, there's 2 key parts to leadership: trust and actually continual growth and learning. So that ability to understand, for me, being a leader is actually a responsibility. It's a duty. It's an obligation. It isn't a prize that I have won because I now have so many people that will listen to me, and because I have this power. And for me, conceptually, those titles, etc., often make people want to behave like that.
Yeah.
But the flip side of that, and it was really interesting because although this organisation was something that I set up, and I was actually working on it for 2-3 years, again, not because I wanted something for myself, but because if we hadn't done this, there were other things happening in the corporate world that could have lent themselves to losing out on everything. So for me, it was collectively bringing what was 20 great leaders that have something to give together so that we can exponentially grow together as well. But what was really interesting, despite having sort of done all of this, is when we first had our conversation where we announced it to everybody, people were like, thank you. And they said thank you to the guy who was behind me.
Wow.
And I didn't notice this. Many of the women noticed it, and they just sort of said to me straight away. And I think in corporate and British parlance, we call this mansplaining, where immediately a guy is credited for something. And there were 2 elements to that. Perhaps there was a natural bias and an unconscious bias, I don't know. But the second element of it was because I hadn't given myself a title. So there is an element in this corporate world that we live in, and exactly what you've said, that success has been defined as people who have reached a certain hierarchy, that have reached a certain powerful status, and that is demonstrated in XYZ ways. That part of the problem is, I suspect there are many, many female leaders in the background.
Yeah.
But because they have not done the right PR, because they haven't necessarily enforced a particular title on themselves, they haven't been perceived as successful or successful leaders. And that's a shame. I think the world is losing out, because you and I both know that leadership comes in many forms. And like, if I went back to our language discussion, one of the words that I would love to use for leadership is guru. And for most of us, our first guru is our mother. You know, who is it that has influenced us, inspired us? Who is it that we followed to do something? For most of us, it will have been our mother, whether it's our biological mother or someone else. That word mother connotates a lot wider than that. So for me, there are many, many leaders who are in the background. And again, that is sometimes lost when we use metrics that are set by a corporate or a Western word that defines success as ultimately materialistic success. So there is that spiritual element in that word leadership that we have really lost. And that's why I sort of want to try and sort of inculcate this word dharmic leadership. And by the way, when I say dharmic, please don't misunderstand that as a religious term. Again, many people will start saying, oh, this is, you know, bringing in of a religion or something like that. It absolutely is not. So if we understood what dharma means, and if we understood what dharmic means, and if there was a word in English that I could translate it to, I would, if it made it easier. Because for me, it's that concept that is more important than any religious aspect to it. Because you and I, Drishti, although may see dharma in very, very many different ways, that doesn't make one of us more or less right. But we can still follow a path of virtuousness and righteousness if what we are doing is with the right mindset.
Yep. So let's give that a go then, because I've got like 10 different questions I want to ask you and dive into at this point. But let's actually stick with Dharma, because I think we've been skirting around it up so far. So let's dive straight in. And if I think about, you know, through some experiences that I know we'll touch on later that you and I share, aside from just being Hindu women, if I think about Dharma and what I internalize when you say dharmic leadership, I see it as the oldest pursuit, you know, like Hindu Dharma is, you know, out of all the great civilizations the world has seen, it is the longest living. It is the one that is not only surviving, but thriving today. We've lost all the others. It is, and I know you'll touch on this soon, but we have a culture that not only has the divine masculine, but also the divine feminine, which is a rarity. But all the pursuits, and there can be many and plural pursuits, but all these pursuits are for the realization of that innate potential of each individual. So it's the pursuit of well-being, it's the pursuit of flourishing, of realizing that potential and allowing it to manifest, right? In the way of enlightenment, in the way of being in that state of flow, whatever you want to call it. But it is that pursuit. And I see it almost sometimes as an act of rebellion, right? And the reason why I say that is because if we look at the world around us, we've got so much baggage from, you know, like the psychology that we grow up with, the environment that we grow up with, so our circumstances, and then our genetic code.
Yeah.
We're always looking for security, comfort, you know, there's aggression, sex, all these different drivers. And by pursuing your flourishing, you are almost saying, I'm going to overcome nature, or I'm going, not necessarily nature, but I'm going to overcome my biogenetic programming to realize something more. And that to me is so different and so relevant in the world that we're talking about, where titles and aggression and metrics rule what success looks like? What would be your thoughts?
So it's a lovely track you're taking us down, and it's when we start looking at this deeper, what makes us do what we do. And this is true for leaders or anybody else, I suppose. If it is in any way a sort of selfish pursuit of some sort, without failure, without doubt, ego comes into it. And that is always going to happen. And so what I see Dharma as is my routing to say, don't become selfish, don't become egoistic, Janhavi. Because there is something beyond this. There is always something beyond. And the Bhagavad Gita is fabulous for this. So, when I teach leadership at work, or when I'm looking at it, I think we describe maybe 5-10 different types of leadership styles. The Bhagavad Gita, if you look at it, it talks about emerging leadership, leadership in chaos. It talks about worker leadership. There's so many different things that it talks about, that actually if people understood leadership from the Bhagavad Gita, they would understand what Dharma is. I mean, the famous, perhaps one of the most famous leaders is Krishna, and is an exemplar of someone that stayed in the background. He never lifted a single weapon, but was the most powerful person probably in the whole of the Mahabharata. But, you know, you can take that symbology of what he did in so many different ways. He was at the front of the chariot. He was a charioteer. But he would have taken a bullet for Arjun. He would have been the first to die, or an arrow rather than a bullet, I suppose. And he agreed never to take up any weapons. But if it hadn't been for him, Arjuna would not have been what he is.
Yep.
And so, and when his biggest message, which I won't say the whole one, but yada yada hi dharmasya, when we talk about that from the Bhagavad Gita, what he is talking about is a leader emerges through taking responsibility. And they emerge because they need to do right. So it is Dharma that takes us to that path. And the other example that I would really use that sort of reminds me of the importance of not having ego and also continuing to learn when you are in any position is J. Krishnamurti, who it's a very small sentence he says and can sound really pithy, but all he said was, truth is a pathless land. And what a great phrase and sentence that is, because what he is saying is we should all be in pursuit of the truth. And whilst the truth is probably one at the top, there are many different ways to get there. And all of us need to be in search for that. And what is great about him, because leadership is talking, but it is also experiencing. And he was one of those people that really showed and led by example. So in 1929, when he actually said that sentence, truth is a pathless land, he closed down what was a growing organization with around 3,000 members at the time.
Right.
And he closed it down because he said, we do not need this sort of followership to be in pursuit of truth. So fundamentally, this idea that leaders are themselves or on a journey, I think is embedded in the core of what we say when we say dharmic leadership. That to pursue leadership, to pursue dharmic leadership, we also have to continue on a journey. And I think that always helps me to sort of reroute my ego, because it's easy in the job that I do. One of my colleagues once said to me, we have a great job. 99% of times I'm being told how great I am. in the feedback that we get, it's always, because I'm the person with the most knowledge, and of course I know what I'm talking about when I've chosen that subject, and I'm going to lead the people in that room based on what I know. If they start going down a track I don't know, I'll bring them back, not because I know everything, but I know what I do know. Therefore, I'll bring them back. So 99% of times we are getting told how great we are. And therefore, actually, one of the things I've noticed is when we have to give negative feedback to any of our course leaders, it is the hardest thing I've ever had to do, because everyone gets defensive. It wasn't because of me. It was the delegate was this type of person, or it was, we were going down a path that I didn't want. So, and this is a natural human instinct, isn't it? When something goes wrong, we blame the environment. We blame the people around us or something like that. And so one of the things I sort of learned quite early on in this role, and perhaps again, this is where women differ, Drishti, and again, I don't want to make blanket statements, but for me, as a mother, I'm constantly being told by my children how I don't match up to their expectations. And for me, actually, that's good. It sort of keeps my ego going, at a certain level that, just because when I'm in a comfortable environment, I can be great, it doesn't mean I am great. And that, I think for women, it's something that we've always held so many different hats. Whether it's a wife, whether it's a mother, whether it's a daughter, whether it's a daughter-in-law, whether it's a sister. And that's not to say men don't do that, but I think often because the patriarchal or the male role historically and for cultural reasons in most cultures has become the one that has that ultimate power, and there was respect was often confused with you must just listen. And it became that command control sort of mechanism, even in familial places. But for women, we have always had to have these different roles where we've always had to sometimes, even if we know we're doing the right thing, even if we know the way we're doing something is right, that we will say, well, actually, this is not about me. This is about how do I give my child the boost that they need? How do I give, even if experience has taught us that what they're doing is wrong, sometimes we have to let our children fail. Sometimes we have to let them do that because we need, the trust is more important than getting it right.
Absolutely. And I'm going to, I want to take us down a slightly different track, building upon what you've just said. But I just want to summarize some of the points that you've made because I think they're awesome. So first, I think you called out that leadership in its most authentic form, or dharmic leadership, means an equal investment in not just our skills and our skill development, but also in our character, to understand how we exist in an ecosystem. It's not just about the individual, but truly understanding how can I help others on their journey to flourish and to realize their own potential. And adding on to that, when you talk about how you are a mother and how you are in relation to others, what I've captured from that anecdote from J. Krishnamurti as well is to be Hindu, to be in the pursuit of Dharma is to be a seeker. So you never stop learning. It's lifelong learning. Yes, you may take on responsibilities in that journey and learn through them also, but you never stop learning. And that keeps us, I guess, as balanced individuals, even if you are having your praises sung left, right, and center. Now, picking on one of those points that you made earlier, success today in the world that we exist in requires an investment in PR, titles, framing, posturing. And so the silent leaders that we all know aren't recognized, aren't valued, and aren't remembered. So, those role models can't even exist for those of us who are looking to express a different form of leadership or a different form, express ourselves and our responsibilities in different arenas. Now, I want us to keep that at the back of our minds, because we're probably at this cusp where we're having, we've got due attention on what it means to be a woman in today's world. We've got due attention on being able to rewrite the journey, or, introduce a new journey or a new narrative in this space. But I want to touch on something that I've been really excited about for this conversation, and that is an experience, even if it is a few years, between us, that you and I share in common. And that is that we've both held the responsibility, of the chair or the president of the National Hindu Students Forum, an organization that you were part of the founding committee of 30 years ago, as it's entering its 30th year now, that seeks to represent and uphold Dharma across the country for Hindu students everywhere. And not only were you the second chair of the organization many moons ago, but you were also the first full-time volunteer for the organization looking to develop it. So what a feat. It's really lovely to be able to reflect on that, having been just part of the organization myself, to see how far it's come since you were there. But if we're talking about rewriting notions or exploring different expressions of leadership, and more so dharmic leadership, what do some of those differences look like? Can you share some of the experiences that you had in taking on that position, and maybe things that you've matured and refined in the years that have come since?
Yeah, and I forget that we shared that, so we should have more of a conversation on that too, Drishti, how things may or may not have changed in 30 years and how things hopefully have got better, actually, because one of the things when we were setting up NHSF, the way we chose our chair is something that I think it really needs to be shared with people. Because, again, very much what I said about titles and everything like that, we came to a decision based on a consensus of a group. At that time, it wasn't a huge group, but it was, what does this organization need now? And it was looked at from a very holistic perspective as to what do we need, both actually, and the people that were around us at that level of thinking, Drishti, I cannot say how grateful I am in words, because the level of thinking was not just what does the organization need, but what does every individual in that organization need for their growth as well. And it is, I'm proud to have been chair, not for myself, in that, oh, I achieved something, but I'm proud because through that role, it helped me to develop so much understanding of this consensus style of leadership. And that understand, when it was first announced that I was going to be taking a year out and everything like that, there was a sort of sense of, oh, am I ready for this? And why have they announced it without me thinking even more about it? And we had to have a lot of conversations after it was announced as well. And also, I suppose when you're a student versus what I do now, you could be really bold and you could go out and say things, you could do things, you could take risk much more. I suppose now in the sort of positions I'm in, I'm much more careful of what I say, much more reticent before I say something. And that's something I've learnt through that position, but also maybe with experience and growth, you realise that more people are looking to you. And the reason I realised that, and perhaps one of my most satisfying moments of having achieved the chair position, is not really, I mean, it's great to see where NHSF is now, but it's some of the individuals whose lives I've touched without even realising it. So I was fortunate enough when I was chair, I did quite a lot of travelling, and there were people in different countries who still sort of say, oh, Janhavi, we remember her from X, Y, and Z. And they're saying it to people like you, I suspect, because now you're interacting with them. So that longevity is another really important part of leadership. Because too often in this day and age, we put people on a pedestal and they fall quite quickly off it too. In fact, one of the interesting stories is when we did our handbook for leadership, literally within a month of it getting published, some of the people we had chosen in that, we had to find a quick way to take them out. Oh, wow. And we had to put appendices because something had happened in the real world.
Wow.
So for me, leadership must stand the test of time as well. And you know, it is great when I hear from you or I hear from someone else that, Janhavi, we met such and such, and they said 20 years ago it was you that made them come to NHSF and they've stuck with it since, or something like that. That gives me immense satisfaction. But the other one, I gave up 1 year of my life to do, and I say give up, I don't feel like I gave it up at all. So again, my language is sort of failing me here, because for me, it was a year of real growth for me. So it was positive in all its facets. So that year that I did, though, that perhaps in modern corporate life there'll be, oh, that was a year wasted, Janhavi, you know what, or you could have been up the ladder much quicker. And you know, to all the youngsters now that are sort of worried about a year or 2 years missing, make the most of it. You know, do what you can, because it's the longevity of leadership that's important. And I said I did 1 year. One of the sort of most satisfying moments for me, I recently went to Kenya on work, and whilst I was there, I sort of met up with various charities that are doing work out in some really poor schools, etc. And the girl who's leading that has actually said she is dedicating her whole life to this.
Wow.
And for me, that was like, wow, you know, and I didn't realize, I thought I was meeting her for the first time. I'd heard about her and I knew I was going to see this charity that she's working with and stuff like that. But the first time we met, she goes, "You don't remember me, do you, Janhavi?" And I was like, yeah, I do. Of course I do. This was, you know, you said you're such and such. And she said, "Janhavi, I met you when I was," I think she was like 6 or 7.
Wow.
And we were at a huge camp in Gujarat. And she said she was just there because her parents were into the stuff that we were doing and everything like that. She just happened to be sort of one of the little kids running around. She said, "You were one of the only people that used to come and sit with me. You'd come from the West, but you did not have any sort of pride, or you didn't feel like you were someone different. You came and sat next to me and you used to eat with me. And I will never forget that. And you taught us so many things." And I always thought, that's what I want to be like. And for me, that gave me immense pleasure that, you know, and although I cannot take the credit for her doing what she's doing now, the fact that I had some part in that, that is for me much more satisfying than having held the sort of chair position. And I don't know if it's too early to ask you, Drishti, whether you feel that sense now that you leave the chair, and whether you sort of feel like, well, actually now I'm ready to move on and do something different in my corporate leadership roles.
It's really interesting because, you know, you talked about that opportunity for a year of investment in yourself. And I look back at the last 4 years with that responsibility, the last 10 years of engaging with NHSF. And I definitely feel it. I definitely feel like a different person, a different woman. And, you know, one of the common misgivings that I encounter when I speak to people is, you know, what's it like being a female leader in a Hindu environment or an Indian environment? And there's often this supposition, or like there's often this stereotype of, well, you must have it really difficult with older men then, or, you know, are you really exceptional that you got in and a guy didn't get in? Like there are these undertones that sometimes come out from the wider you know, groups of people that you interact with. And it's really interesting because, just like you said, when a leader is selected, it's not done by a democratic vote. It's done by a consensus. It's done by advisors. And it's done by what is the available best for the org, what is the available best or opportunities for those individuals. And I've never once encountered that discomfort. You know, that you gave that example of you setting up this new academy for board excellence, and, you know, in different spheres where the men behind you have been congratulated and you've encountered mansplaining. And what I think is really enriching and empowering is that because we come from a culture where we have so many festivals where we're celebrating the feminine, we have so many festivals that are dedicated, for lack of a better word, to goddesses, to female deities. We're quite comfortable with the notion of female leadership. yes, okay, you know, there may be more opportunities for it to manifest, but when it's there, actually, you don't really hit as many roadblocks as maybe we might initially think. So that for me has been the most eye-opening thing, that actually there've been so many people that have had so much comfort, so much reasoned belief and faith in, you know, a woman taking the helm. And that's been one of the most empowering things. And the second thing that I think you touched on that I'll expand on is this expression of what comes naturally. We were
Yes.
talking about, you know, leadership in every other sphere of our life being built on a masculine archetype. And if I think about what I can naturally express now and what I'm comfortable about, no matter where I go, is bringing my authentic values of collaboration. I don't want to lead and say, hey, this is what I think and this is what we're doing. I want to know what everyone in the room is thinking. I want to know what they're feeling and why. And I want to understand what's the common thread that binds all of us and how we can take that first step forward to create a sustainable change, not something that will be undone, not something that, you know, someone's going to disagree with 5 minutes later or a month later or 5 months later. It's a case of, what do we all believe is the right thing to do? Let's go for that. And then as we learn more, we'll take that next step. And it's something that I think is a bit of a buzzword, you know, yeah. Collaboration. But what does true collaboration look like? What are the spheres that foster it? And for me, NHSF has definitely been a great incubation hub, a training ground to see that manifest and to be able to play with true collaboration.
And what I hope you do as well, and something that I feel that I've been able to do, is, okay, we're not going to change the world in one day, the corporate worlds that we're in, it's not going to change. But slowly there are bits that you chip away at, that you change people's perceptions, you start changing people's mindsets as to how we get things done. It won't happen overnight, and it's not something, but what I hope we bring to the respective forums in whichever world we're working in, that what you do is, as seekers of truth, people, what we try and do, which perhaps is really what is, do I want to say unique? I mean, unique's a really difficult word, but perhaps one of the differentiators that we as Hindu women bring is that we try and integrate what we know, what we believe, in the worlds that we're living in. And we do it positively and proactively. So, you know, both those words that you said, like you said, they are buzzwords, aren't they? Sustainability, diversity and inclusion. All of these words are sort of ones that in the corporate world, it's as if someone has just come up with this. And it's always fascinating that most of these things, it's not until Bill Gates or someone in the US has said something, or Harvard has said it, that it's suddenly become the most topical issue. And, oh, how come we hadn't thought of ESG before? Most of these concepts are things that I think are so integral to my own being, you know, and they were already there. So it's things that I hope that we bring into the world that we go into. But because of our continual quest for learning, we're also saying, well, what's good about what you do? How do we integrate this to create that sustainable, diverse, inclusive world without necessarily having to label it as such? I think we don't strive for those labels in the same way that perhaps men and Western counterparts do, partly maybe for historical, partly for cultural, whatever the reasons are. Perhaps we don't do that in the same way. And your point about actually female goddesses and stuff like that, one of the things I will say, and it was an important point that you made, that sometimes we don't see these role models. I do think there's a role to be played here where we do need to articulate those female leaders that were there. So within Hindu culture, within history, there are so many. You know, and given that this is sort of our week where we're trying to elaborate on it, I would encourage everybody to look and really see the number of great ladies that were there. So I was just writing down and thinking, we have within military, we had ladies in the 13th century. Rudrama Devi, her name was, in the 13th century. We had Abbakka Rani, we had Jhansi Ki Rani, which many people know. Ahilya Bai Holkar, we had so many people. Some of the Sikh gurus' wives. We hear a lot about the gurus in the Sikh traditions, but those wives, some of them gave up their children for protection of the Hindu Dharma.
Mm.
And if you listen to some of the wording that they said, they were in the background, but their sacrifices, what they did and how they did it, took great courage. So, and then in the spheres of intellect as well, the famous one is when Madan Mishra is going to debate with Adi Shankara. And they said, yeah, but who can be the right judge for us here? And it was Madan Mishra's wife, because they said she will be the best judge of what we do. So some call her Uma Devi, some call her Ubhaya Bharati. So she was seen as the best person, because what qualities did she have? That despite being his wife, she would be impartial in this judgment. And they would have enough trust, both of them, both the husband as well as Adi Shankara, that whatever she says will be right. And I think, again, that's something that we mustn't forget, that as women, we have got lots of role models in the past, but we do have to search for them, because perhaps the PR around them wasn't as good. And, in this day and age where everybody's desperate to put out a tweet, put out a Instagram with their name, or have so many followers, perhaps it's hard to understand, but some of the greatest achievements in Bharat are anonymous.
Yeah.
So I remember going to a place called Ajanta Ellora, which is in the south, and it's one of the largest monolithic statues in the world that was created by hand. No one knows how it was done, because in those days you wonder how it could have that form of architecture. And the guide that took us round when we went there, he said something to me that has really sort of always stuck. He showed me a picture of himself that some artist had drawn. He said, this was, one of these street artists painted it. He said, what do you notice about this? She said, yeah, it's really good. It was, you do see some great artists, don't you? So it was a good picture. And he showed this to me. And he showed me at the bottom, look, that's the signature of the artist. Yes. We're in this massive place, these caves that have all these drawings. He said, look at all these drawings, Janhavi, what do you notice? Look, and these are phenomenal, because the way they've done the architecture. He said, nowhere, anywhere do we know who did this. There isn't a single signature up there. Someone saying, I did this. Yeah. And I thought, wow, what, in this day and age, the moment we do something, we put that copyright Janhavi Dadarkar 2011, or we put, Instagram or whatever it is. We need people to know it was us that did it. A
claim on ideas, a claim on whatever it is that we produce, rather than it being something that just...
Irrespective of how good it is. That's the funny thing. Even before we know it's good, we've got to put our name on it. And again, I think this is a quality that women throughout history have demonstrated, that we're doing something because it's the right thing to do. And that is what Dharma is about, that, you do it because it's the right thing to do. The accolades or whatever else should be in the fact that the right thing's been done, and hopefully we've achieved the right. So the idea of sustainability, the idea of diversity, all of these sort of things, I think have been around and have been rooted in our faith for a long time. And that's not to say that India or any other country has got it all right. They haven't, in practice, a lot of this hasn't been put into place. But culturally, that belief, that mindset is something that I hope we don't lose, because that holistic mindset is what will help us to create that sustainable world that we so desperately need for the world now.
Yeah, absolutely. And, probably a conversation for another day, or maybe for another opportunity. But I wonder how history might change, or that which is written as history might change, if we were to look at it through through a different value lens, because we only remember certain people as heroes, as victors, because we're looking at it through a particular lens. And if we start changing those values, I wonder what history would look like, which women would pop out, which women would start to, present themselves as role models that are forgotten today. So that was one point. And, I think you're taking us right to the end, because I think time is running away. But you've touched on something really beautiful that I'd like to maybe end on as the final note. And that is that, we straddle two worlds right now. And the most conducive thing that we can do as human beings is to integrated wholes. We don't want to be Hindu women in one sphere and then, like kick-ass business women in another sphere. We want to bring both together, whether, whatever roles we're playing. And as you said, we have many hats that we will put on throughout the day, sometimes simultaneously.
Yes.
So in that pursuit of that integrated whole, where we have these values that allow the expression of that which is natural, that which is feminine, as a strength that can really help the world we live in, that will help it make it more sustainable, that will help others around us to grow and for us to grow as well, whilst also, pursuing those spheres where it's not just okay to be in the background, and you do have to stand up and be counted. You do have to present yourself as a leader in this world that we live in. It's not acceptable just to go with the philosophy and not pursue that, because it's not in touch with our world today. But we have, I think, a unique opportunity, particularly as Hindu women, to be that bridge between the two, to say, here are my values, here is how I want to develop my character, but also allow, the opportunity for others. And I also want to do good in the world and have the responsibility and ability to do good in the world. How do we perhaps bridge that gap? What, if you had, 2 or 3 things that you would say to the women tuning in today, what would those 3 things be that we could start today? Practical tips that we can end on.
So it's a great question, and it's if we have to boil it down to 3 things. The first thing I would say is redefine success, both for yourself and for the world that you live in. Don't just go on the metrics that you are familiar with or that others are dictating for us. And when you redefine how success looks like to you, you will be happier as a person, and a happy person will be successful. So the first one must be that we must understand what we want. And it's not an easy thing. Again, the Gita and many of our scriptures talk about, to do that, you have to, before you can become a leader, you have to have self-realization. And therefore that self-realization of what success looks like, and that actually I'll be happy at this point. I don't need to keep going for the next, all of those sort of things. So define success is the first one. 2, have courage. Have courage in your convictions. And remember, again, there's a great quote in the Gita that talks about roles, the roles that we have to take. So they say, basically, the crux of that verse in the Gita is, a job is what is assigned to you, but a role is what is required. So understand the role that is required of us, and not just the job that's been given to you. Go beyond just what someone has told you that you need to get this done. And the final one I will say is let people judge you by your actions. Again, in this world where voices can easily be drowned out by a louder voice or a more popular voice, we are not here for popularity contests. The depth in what we must do, if you really want to change the world for a sustainable world that is more inclusive, we are looking at, and I often say this phrase, which I suppose sounds like a legal phrase, but it isn't, but we are looking for equity, not equality. And equity is about everybody being able to be part of this world in a fair way, because there are people who are born with disabilities, people who will not have the same benefits that I have. I'm fortunate in where I started my life, so I'm already at another level by the time I started. So that third final point is that because we're not after popularity, and I think you sort of started saying it, but there's always this analogy that I love about when you look at the lion, and a lion is chosen to be the king of the animal world. And people say king of the jungle. It's slightly incorrect. It's not the king of the jungle, it's the king of the savannah, because the tiger is the king of the jungle. So that's just my bit of the environment bit in there. But in terms of how the lion becomes the king of the animal world, it is because people respect the way it does its work. So we will earn respect because we do what's right. We seek out truth and we continue on that pathway. So as women, we must have courage that to continue to redefine success in our own terms. And we hold more power and influence than many people. I said the first guru is your mother. So we have the ability to influence lots and lots of others in many more ways than others. So take courage and continue on that path would be my sort of final message.
Thank you. I'm going to share something that came to mind while you were speaking, and 2 points really. What comes through as something so unique and defining is that this worldview is not one where we are a collection of individuals. We are instead part of a collective, where there's an interconnectedness, that our actions and the consequences of those actions don't just affect us, they affect others. And there is a thread that binds us in that way. And if I think of your last example, as mothers, should we choose that path? And should we have that opportunity? We bring with it the opportunity to literally shape the world view of the next generation. And that is not just, an immense power and immense privilege, but also a responsibility. And to quote Jiddu Krishnamurti, who you mentioned earlier, if you have the ability to respond, it becomes your responsibility.
Yes.
It's really like the notion that I think came through your points. So for us as women, for us in all the different roles that we hold, we will have a different way to respond. We will have a different thing that we will add. It doesn't have to be the same as anyone else. It doesn't have to be the same as a mass population. Whatever we have as individuals, if we can contribute that, we ought to. That's our responsibility. And that really shone through to me. So I'll end on that note. Thank you, Janhavi, and thank you, Tattva, for giving us this opportunity to discuss, different elements of womanhood through a Hindu lens across this week. It's been a real joy, a real pleasure. And I hope it's been an insightful discussion for those of you who are joining us online. And I hope that you'll stay tuned for the further conversations that are planned and in store for you too. Thank you and namaste.
Namaste, Drishti.